Record. Good to go. Awesome. So we got about 40 minutes, I guess. Um, okay. So yeah, again, just to start things off, I really appreciate you making the time and to talk with me about for I really appreciate you participating in this series and having um, um, any sort of interest in it. And especially because you have a very unique background. I've interviewed about 30 artists, I think, so far for this. And I initially started by interviewing musicians from around the world who were living in under authoritarian regimes, and
Mhm.
as sort of a bellwether or canary in a coal mine as to what might happen here.
Yeah,
Shifted to talking with American artists because just got real. Um,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
so can you just um, start by telling me about yourself and your background, just like a little bit of synopsis? Because I mean, you have a fascinating story, and I just kind of want to hear a little more about it from you.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, my story starts, obviously a long time ago, but it, I come from a fairly diverse background. My dad was both white and black. My mom, black and white. So a mixture of that kind of thing going on. My dad was a physician on a Indian health reservation back in New Mexico. My dad was actually a very colorful individual. He passed away in 2023, but yeah, he was an awesome individual. But he was a Green Beret Special Forces, then got out of the Army, went to medical school, then joined the Indian Health Service, and that's how my family ended up in New Mexico. So I was born on a reservation in New Mexico. And so I grew up partly there, and then lived in Seattle for a little bit, and then eventually moved to North Carolina, where my mom's family was. And so that was a pretty drastic, as you would imagine, a drastic change from growing up, I mean, granted, there weren't a lot of black folks in New Mexico, but at the same time, it was a fairly different environment than when you get to, Durham, North Carolina, which was like, I saw green for the first time in my entire life, basically. But anyway, grew up a lot in North Carolina, went to middle and high school there. And so this is where things kind of get a little bit interesting because I, I never really embraced, the idea of military as it was, I don't know, at the core of my being, I was never really a traditional military type person. I always gravitated towards, artistic stuff, writing, music, that kind of thing. But it was almost more out of necessity, and it was it was a free education. I ended up going to the Naval Academy, so
Okay.
it's a free education, obviously, and it's a wonderful school. And so I've always kind of had this sort of mix of embracing the artistic side of my personality, but I've always had a respect for authority and respect for tradition.
Mm.
I mean, I think part of that may be just naturally a part of my personality, but also I think, growing up when you see whether or not you're actually acknowledging it, I mean, you see your parents, you see what they're doing. It's soaking in subconsciously, probably. I think that probably played a part in it as well. My appreciation for, a rigid structure and tradition and that kind of thing.
Right.
So, going to the Naval Academy wasn't a drastic change from certain aspects of my personality, but at the same time, I felt like a lot of my creativity was definitely stifled in that environment.
Mm.
But at the same time, I think, when I look back on that experience, it was something that definitely made me a better, more well-rounded person and kind of gave me a better perspective on how to lead a more disciplined life.
Okay.
And I mean, I think, discipline is not bad. I think it's almost like I kind of look at I'm kind of into the I Ching. So when I think of like
Right on.
limitations, I read a lot. It's just, I find it fascinating anyway. But there's like this one hexagram that talks about limitations. And it's almost like people think that having no limits is like freedom, but that actually is not freedom. I think people need too much limitation, you're restricted and you snuff like your flame out. But if you have no limitations, then you almost are just free to do whatever you want, and it's almost counterproductive. And so I think that there's a
Right.
certain amount of discipline that's needed in your life on a day-to-day basis to keep you focused. But if you have too much rigidity, then you lose the beauty of it. And so I think finding a little bit of balance there, having that history of being at the Naval Academy and kind of having that military side sort of introduced that I guess that sort of barrier, that limitation that kept me focused and disciplined.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so that kind of, as you would imagine, I think Michelle had mentioned that I am retired military now, and so it wasn't a short-lived thing as you would imagine. So it ended up being a very long and drawn out thing a journey that I took.
Wow.
So, there was a long time in there where a number of years where I was almost struggling to find my identity because I always had that love of creativity, artistry, and that kind of thing. It's not that they can't coexist, that in a military environment, but just when you look at that culture, it's not a culture that necessarily promotes that thing all the time. And so, I'm not saying it doesn't have it in there. It definitely does, but it's not necessarily something that you see on the surface of the military culture, that embracing of sort of like that free-spiritedness, creativity, artistry, that kind of thing. It's there, but it's not necessarily publicized. You got to look in the nooks and crannies to find it.
Yeah.
And so for me, I was for a while I was struggling with those two, I don't know, I wouldn't call them two identities, but those two kind of competing sides of my personality and
Yeah.
trying to reconcile. And I think there was a period of time when I was in medical school, because I went to a civilian medical school when I right out of the Naval Academy. And so my time, like right when I started there, I was kind of almost going in the opposite direction, just with just no limitations and just no discipline. And I was young and stupid, but I think back to that time, and I think that there were a lot of opportunities that I wasted because I was almost trying to reject what I thought was too much discipline, having been at the Naval Academy. I think part of it was just immaturity,
Mhm.
but I think the other part of it was me trying to find the balance between those two parts of my personality.
Okay.
And I think as I've gotten older over the course of the past 10, 15, 20 years, that I finally found that as I started writing and recording my own music
Hmm.
and finding that side to actually fill that part of my personality, but then at the same time managing the military side. I mean, I, I know this, I don't want to make this too long-winded, but it kind of gets into the core of what I had been struggling with for a very long time. And I think that once I came to grips with myself and understanding that both of those sides can coexist and actually be integrated, and I ended up specializing in anesthesia. I'm an anesthesiologist, so there's a lot of creativity that goes into how you basically deliver that type of medical care. And
Huh.
it's not, obviously it's not 100% all creative. I mean, there
Right.
obviously it's founded in medical science and pharmacology and pharmacokinetics and all that stuff, but not to get into the weeds on that. But
Yeah.
there is a certain amount of creativity and artistry when it comes to interacting with patients, establishing a bond in a short period of time in the pre-op area. And then, because you have their lives in your hands and you have to make them understand that you want to empower them with knowledge and with empathy and those kind of, so there's a certain amount of artistry that goes into that because you have to use a certain amount of intuition and sensitivity and that kind of thing. And so those are some characteristics that I think are translatable into
Mhm.
the musical and creative side. And so those are some of the things where I started to find ways of integrating the two, and I found out that you can be both. You can be both.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I am now. And I mean, I'm retired now, so I can kind of leave the military part behind. But I think what I take with me from that experience is that you can do all those things and have them integrated.
Uh-huh.
And you don't have to reject one for the sake of the other.
Sure. Sure. Right. Exactly. I mean, I don't want to get too I don't want to be like a student in college trying to impress a professor and BSing my way through it. But I mean, Greek society, you could be a warrior and also, very well educated and Um, and a lot of the great writers from the 20th century were in the military. I mean, Hemingway, I believe, was a soldier as well. So I mean, so the coexistence. So I guess you're probably, but you, my hunch is that you probably don't consider Pete Hegseth to be a warrior poet, right?
No.
did you did,
No.
did you see when he was like kind of like doing a kind of like a scat thing or whatever? I don't know what the fuck.
I don't I honestly don't understand anything that's happening right now when it comes to
Yeah.
trying to apply logic to that arena right now is very difficult.
Right. Yeah. Which is like part of what's driving everybody insane, I think, right? Is like
Yeah.
the military. I mean, seeing that parade that he did, for the, I don't remember what it was, but it was his birthday or something like that. And the military was just like, these guys are very well trained, but they couldn't have looked more bored. In
Well, I think one of the things that one of the important points here when we look at the military and what it means to be a part of the military, whether you're an officer or enlisted, there and this goes to the very point of a lot of what this interview is about is talking about authoritarian leadership and authoritarian governments, is that when we take an oath to the Constitution.
right.
And I think what folks are missing or not focusing on is that we don't pledge allegiance to an individual. That's period. We pledge allegiance to the Constitution and what it means. And if you have somebody in power that doesn't respect the Constitution,
Right.
then you're already starting from a faulty ground.
Sure.
You're
Sure.
starting from a poisonous standpoint. And
Yeah.
that's something that I can't stress enough because granted I'm happy that I'm retired from the military, but at the same time I have a tremendous amount of respect for the commitment that I had for the military and the commitment that the current soldiers and Marines and Air Force cadets and et cetera
Yeah.
have that are currently active duty. And it is disrespectful to them
Yeah.
when you expect them to pledge their allegiance to an individual. Granted, the president is the commander in chief. He is in charge of the military, but their allegiance is not to him, it is to the Constitution.
Right.
And that is the important thing to remember that I think a lot of people either who have never served don't really think about that aspect.
Yeah. Yep.
But especially if you have somebody in a position of power who is corrupt, and let's make no bones about it, he is corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
When you have somebody who's in a position of power who is corrupt and is looking at it from a purely selfish standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
there is no way that unfortunately the military is in a subjugated position because they have, I mean, he is in charge, and unfortunately, when you have somebody in charge who is corrupt, that's how these authoritarian type regimes are formed.
Sure.
Um, Luckily, this is an all volunteer force at this point, and people can leave. They sign a commitment, but once that commitment is done, if they don't want to be a part of it, they can walk away.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
I'm not advocating one way or another I mean, that's their life and what they choose to do. It's just from my standpoint, I feel like it's important to, number one, respect the Constitution, but two, also have a healthy respect for the men and women who are still serving, who are struggling with this current situation because they're
Totally.
conflicted, because they have, the person who's in charge of the military telling them one thing, but at the same time, what this individual is saying is not always conducive to upholding the ideals and the tenets of the Constitution of the United States of America. And so those things, that kind of conflict for people that truly believe in this country and believe in the ideals of this country. And I personally, and I can get into it later, but I personally believe, I 100% believe in the ideals of this country.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have, unfortunately, human beings, and I'm not necessarily naming any particular ethnicity or religious background, gender, or whatever, when you have entities that aren't able to live up to those ideals, or choose to not, like, willingly choose to not live up to those ideals for the sake of their own benefit,
Yeah.
that is an obvious problem.
Right. Right. Gosh, there's a few different directions we can go from what you just said. That was very well stated on your part. I think that is one of the underlying tensions that you can kind of feel even when you know go outside in your community. If you don't have military experience, you just don't know what that culture's like, and you question like, well, you know, would it be like 10 or 20% of people who would stick by Trump and defy their oath, or would it be like, the other the inverse? You know, people like me who haven't started have don't really have a clear idea of like, you know, you know the degree to which um a person would in the military would put the Constitution, you know, above the president. I mean, it's just such
I,
a
I think that I think people that are in the military who, because I mean, I deployed to Afghanistan in 2013. I had one deployment to Afghanistan. I mean, I had some other before I became an anesthesiologist. I did some counter patrol things with the with an LP on an amphibious transport dock in Japan off the coast of Korea and in the South Asia Pacific. But it wasn't my only like desert deployment was Afghanistan.
yeah,
But folks that have been in combat zones, who've deployed numerous times, who have done it for the sake of this country, I would hope that they would think about why they are serving and
right,
realize that again, I go back to, pledging an oath to the Constitution. I mean, that you are doing it for the Constitution, you're doing it for the country, you're not doing it for an individual.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I would hope that when you talk about who would, you know, sign a pledge to one individual, I can't in my heart of hearts believe that folks that truly have been a part of the military for the right reason would choose to do that.
yeah,
And if they did choose to do that, they need to leave the military because that is not what it means to be in the military. That's not what it means. I mean, again, that's my opinion, but I think when you look at what the definition is of serving your country, I mean, it's there in plain language. You're serving your country. You're not serving an individual.
absolutely.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, that's how I feel. I mean, I think I would hope. And again, I mean, I don't look at life from a cynical perspective. I try to be as realistic as possible
yeah,
because I think that, and that kind of gets into my whole idea about, artistic movements and embracing freedom of speech and people that think that one person can't make a difference. Yeah, my single voice may not mean much to, it's not like 1,000 people. It's not like I'm, at the Oscars, saying something, but if enough people actually take, an hour or so or however much time and truly speak their mind and just stand up for what they believe is right,
absolutely.
that becomes a movement if enough people do it.
Yeah,
And so I think that in this situation, if enough people do this kind of stuff and enough people stand up to these kind of things, I think we can actually make a difference.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
and that's me being realistic, not me being
Right.
hopeful or idealistic. And that's not me saying, oh, this is not going to do anything and being cynical. I think cynicism is like it's a cancer, honestly. I mean, if I had to decide which side I lean, I tend to be probably more cynical than not, but I try to fight it because if you give in to that kind of cynicism and resignation, you can see what can end up happening. And this is the time where we should be hopeful, but we can't sit there and hug a tree and be hopeful. We need to actually do something about it. You need to have some strength and conviction behind what you're saying and doing. You can't just say, "Oh, well, I hope it gets better," or if we hold hands and sing a song, it's going to get better. That it's not going to get better if that's your approach. You need to do something about it. You need to be strong about it. And for the sake of going on a tirade, I mean, I don't want to do that, but I think it's important that we show some strength and solidarity.
Yeah, you
And
know, and the other thing too is, you know, when people say, "Oh, I don't know if I'll it's just me if I'll be able to make a difference. I think something that's lost in that way of thinking is that, well, the the difference you're making is to yourself? You know, what if the simple act of going out and trying your best to affect some kind of change or stating your position publicly or taking a risk is actually strengthening your own character and making you less cynical. Like that's the difference that can be made. And so that
Yeah.
alone is a reason to act and to not just give in to fatalism and hopelessness is it's just to have the feeling that like because I mean I don't know if you go to many protests, but even it's an exhilarating experience, and if even if you don't maybe change somebody's mind, you still go home feeling better about yourself.
Yeah.
And we've also got this wacky thing going on now where like um the people who were derided for decades for lacking character or moral values are now the ones who are the people of character and values. It's a fascinating
Yeah.
turn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So
Definitely.
one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and I do want to get into the artistic side of this because that's really I want the series to be speaking to artists and musicians and educate them because a lot of times and this isn't a judgment at all. I think that some of the best art that's made is made in isolation, and people just can't handle the news that they want to detach. But I do want to kind of get your take on the fact that when you're talking about you go to the military and you pledge an oath to the Constitution. Well, now we've got ICE, and from my understanding, it's from what I've gathered, it's like an 8-week training, and you don't have to have, and you can be like 19, I think, or so. And the oath, the screening process is about who did you vote for? So maybe I'm off base on that. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But
Yeah, I'm actually not up to speed on those details on the training for ICE, but so I can't necessarily speak on it. But if what you say is if there's some validity to what you're saying, then I mean that's horrible, honestly. It's
yeah,
horrible.
yeah, just this um just to have this idea that because all the funding, all the billions of dollars that in the recent congressional budget that went to ICE, they're going to use that money somehow,
Yeah.
and all that. But yeah, not to two different tangents. So tell me more about how you know as an artist you value the just a basic simple question like you have the military experience and you've got a fascinating story. I almost want to write a book about you. But like tell me what it's like to be an artist, a musician, and making the kind of music you make while also having that military background. Like do you have do you have a certain respect and appreciation for being able to express yourself that maybe people who didn't serve in the military don't?
Yes, yes. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about that, struggling with the two different identities and trying to integrate. I mean, I think that, you know, it was for a long time, for a very long time, over the past, like, up till about maybe 5 years ago or so, 5 or 6 years ago or so. I mean, I kept those lives very, very separate. I mean, to a certain extent, I still do. Well, I'll say I did up until, being retired now, because there's a certain line of professionalism that you need to maintain. And some of the subject matter and the things that I write about are not necessarily universally accepted as routine and conservative type stuff. So I try to keep that, and it's contained or sort of compartmentalized to a certain degree. I think now it's a little more integrated and open, but there's a little bit, it's still a little bit of a divide because not everybody understands. Because a lot of the things that I write about, I write in metaphor, and my metaphors can be a little jarring. The videos that I've done are some kind of weird to put it lightly. But all of that is intentional, and there's a message behind what I'm doing. And I've grown up, I've always liked, sort of off kilter, horror, dark kinds of things. But not everybody is on that frequency. So I respect that, and I don't want to, frighten anybody by any stretch of the imagination, especially folks that are used to being in a conservative compartment. So that's why I still keep a little bit of separate, like a little bit of a barrier there. But as far as having an avenue for expressing, create my creative side, was invaluable, honestly. Like being in the military and living most of my life in a very rigid, um, for lack of a better word, rigid is probably about the best word I could use to describe it. But in a very rigid kind of schedule, and everything was very regimented. I'm medical corps, or I was medical corps. So medical corps is way more relaxed than like line. So to kind of give you a little bit of a background on just that terminology. So when I was at the Naval Academy, Naval Academy back when I was going through was all about producing line officers, and line officers like your wartime specialties, like
Okay.
surface warfare, flight, SEALs, Marine Corps was something you could choose for service selection. Medical corps was something that was kind of hidden. My brother actually, believe it or not, he went to the Naval Academy and graduated the year I came in. And he went medical corps as well. So he kind of gave me a little bit of an insight on how to navigate that path. And so I knew the right people to talk to. I knew there was a way to do it. But anyway, I was able to graduate and get a medical corps assignment and get into medical school and go to medical school straight out of the Naval Academy. But the reason I mention that is because medical corps in and of itself was a much more relaxed, it's more relaxed. I mean, they still have obviously the rules and regulations that are typical of a military officer, et cetera, but it's not, it's still a little bit more relaxed than your typical line officer. And that's understandable because, I mean, your line officers, they're the ones that are like, COs of ships. They're the ones that are like, in charge, like actually on the battlefield. We're back at the hospital, back at the forward operating bases. I mean, what we do is still very important and can be dangerous, but at the same time, we are not on patrols. We're not typically not on patrol. Some of us have been, but I luckily never had to go on overt patrols in Afghanistan. I was, in a protected camp with the Australian Special Forces, and so there was once or twice that I went a little outside the wire just to kind of, and I would go into different Afghan territories and stuff, but it was nothing like going on patrols where you had a real chance of getting blown up by an IED. But we took care of a lot of people that did get blown up by IEDs, so that's a whole different story. But anyway, so the medical corps in and of itself was a lot more relaxed. That being said, it was still regimented and still something that um, to a large degree didn't afford a lot of liberty to kind of express yourself in certain ways. I'd have little pocket rebellions. I mean, I would grow my hair out a little bit out of regs every once in a while, and then I'd have to cut it and that kind of thing. So, very small, like pocket rebellious type stuff. But having music as something as an outlet was one of the best things that I could have ever sort of cultivated for myself. And it started small. It started like back in 2005. I got bought this little Tascam 4-track tape recorder, and I had always been kind of like writing little like doing stuff on my guitar, my acoustic guitar, and I was like, you know what? I just want to start, recording. So I started reading about how to do multi-track recording, and I got into some of this like occult artwork, and I started getting into this kind of weird, for lack of a better word, weird stuff. And I was like, this is kind of cool. And I started doing some instrumental stuff. And then I came up with this band, Garage and then I like, next thing you know, I'm actually recording things on tape. And then I moved on to CD. And this is back in like 2005, 2006. And then just from there, it took off. But it was always something that I kept in my back pocket, kind of hidden. That was my way of sort of, leaving all that behind and kind of coming home and sort of I had all these things in my head, all these like ideas and melodies and you know, and just kind of I wanted a way to commit that to tape and I just was just almost intoxicated by creativity. It sounds like cliche, but I truly I mean, I would like go to sleep, couldn't sleep, stay up all night recording. I just loved it. Just loved it. And I still love it. Although I don't have, I have a son now and I'm married, so it's a little bit harder. I get tired a lot, a lot more easily now than I used to, but still, it's the same kind of joy and same kind of it just makes me really happy. And so it definitely was an outlet then, and even now that I'm not in the military, it's still an awesome outlet for me.
So were you actually doing those recordings in Afghanistan?
No. So in Afghanistan, I was there for a little shy of a year. I did have my a guitar shipped to me though. I had like a Fender HSH that I would just practice on sent to me. So I actually did write some songs while I was in Afghanistan because I lived in a so it was funny. Like the place that I was actually roomed with an orthopedic surgeon from California. His name's Tim Wimmer. We're still friends on Facebook, but anyway, we shared this you know like a draytainer, it's almost like a storage compartment. That's what we lived in. And so it was very small. It was about the size of maybe about the size about half the size of this room right here. Um and so I wrote music when we weren't in the operating room. We were pretty much on call 24/7. So when like, you know, casualty came in, we actually treated mostly Afghan nationals. There were a few coalition forces that came, guys that came in, but most of them were Afghan nationals. Some were DOA, some just had like blown off legs. Some had one guy had his hand. He basically had a gun, some kind of like explosive device went off in his hand, and his hand was basically split from here to here and filleted. And so Tim Wimmer and I stayed up all night. He did a hand reconstruction. I actually did a nerve block and blocked his arm and his hand, and we were up for like 8 hours reconstructing his hand from like set. No, it was actually 12. It was like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So it was 12-hour procedure all night. So those kind of things you just don't forget that kind of stuff. But and I know that's kind of a tangential story, but
Yeah,
yeah, it was pretty cool.
it's amazing. Were the topics that you were dealing with in your music related to your experience in the military, or were they, um, or was that not the case?
Totally not the case. Honestly, this latest album, the Whores of Holyrood that I just released, that truly has been the only album that I've ever done that really dealt with even, and that one's drenched in metaphor, but it's still the most like the only album that really deals with political themes. Everything that I've done up until now has been very much mystical, um, occult, theoretical. Like Garage was a little bit more, it was dealt with more. I guess it sort of embrace darkness a little bit more than what I'm doing now. I mean, my stuff now is still dark, but I think with Garage, there's a little bit more wallowing in the darkness. I think wasn't always healthy. And so a lot of the theme, I was doing a lot of occult, dark ambient type stuff with Garage. And then with Zabus, like when my dad died in 2023, I ended Garage and kind of transitioned into Zabus. And I made a commitment to myself that I would start dealing with topics. I wasn't gonna like water it down and make it, oh, now we're gonna start singing about balloons and puppies, but that was not the case. But at the same time, I think that there's a way to still, you know, still maintain your touch with darkness and emotionality, but do it in a way that's constructive.
Yeah.
And I think with Garage, I was bordering on some things that were not necessarily constructive to my own emotional well-being. And I think with Zabus, I think there are ways to have topics and themes that you discuss and write about that are still, you can talk about dark things, but you can find a way to craft the story where you do approach hope in a way that is constructive. And I think that if you're ever gonna, if people are gonna, I don't want people to hear this music and just be like depressed and want to go kill themselves. That's not the point of any like creative artist that tries to claim that they're a nihilist. I mean, that's like the antithesis of creativity is being a true nihilist. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that you know what I mean? I think that like, you know, you can write about, I think there are lots of people who write about it, but the mere fact that you sat down and wrote a poem or wrote lyrics and sat and spent 8 hours or however many hours recording your music, that is the antithesis of true nihilism.
Yeah.
If you're a true nihilist, you're going to go out there and kill yourself or destroy something.
So,
You're not going to be creating anything, and at least that's my opinion. But so for me, I think that if I'm going to do anything that's going to be constructive, and reject nihilism, which is kind of the point of what I'm doing right now, is I'm going to be trying to write about things that you can have like a state of the world address or state of the current situation, which is miserable, it is dark, it is depressing, but there is a way out of it.
sure.
And I mean, I think us having this conversation is a small way to kind of work ourselves out of it.
Yeah, for sure. For the sake of the audience, can you just rattle off a few bands that really inspired your projects? Just so we have a little grounding in terms of.
Yeah. Um,
Are you wearing a Cro-Mag shirt? Is it?
that's exactly what I'm wearing.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what
yeah.
so that I have like there's like a little like the whole crossover movement. That was growing up, that was like one of my favorite periods because the crossover thrash doesn't necessarily influence my music now, but but like suicide, like the how I left tomorrow when I can't even smile today, best wishes, leeway, I mean, Born to Expire, but I actually like Desperate Measures and their last one, Open Mouth Kiss, was really good. I mean, actually, I like all of Leeway stuff. And Eddie Sutton, rest in peace. He was awesome. But anyway, so I love the crossover thrash, like period of time. So that was. But as far as influences for me now, I would say that for different projects. So for Bell Barrow, which has been, I just released a core pulp in April. That was Mersbo. Throbbing Gristle. Believe it or not, the Spheres era Pestilence. Like I mean, I grew up listening to a lot of death metal too, but I love that Pestilence album, Spheres, and it got a lot of people hated that album, but I love that album because I
You,
think it's just
you,
wonderful. I mean, do you know the Spheres album by any chance?
I don't, but you're digging deep here, man. This is this.
Yeah, Sphere. I mean, I studied that before I recorded Core Pulp. I studied that album because I bought it when it came out in '93, and I thought it was amazing. Because I bought that at the same time I bought Cynic's Focus album, and
Okay.
so I bought those two CDs together, and I was like, my mind is being blown in so many different directions. I don't even understand what I'm listening to, and I still think Cynic as a band. I think they were channeling some like extra dimensional alien type language that they were recording. I mean, Paul Masvidal, awesome. I mean, it's just crazy how what they were doing back in 1993. But anyway, so Spheres era Pestilence, Gorguts Obscura. That is like one of the best. That album is amazing, and that album actually is influence. I have two Bell Bar releases that have not been released yet that I did in July, in August, and so one of them is like I took Gorguts Obscura and did my sort of interpretation of that style. And so that's one of the Bell Bar albums I'm going to release probably in January. And then I have another one that um influenced by Dead Can Dance. So like I really was into the Spleen and Ideal era, Into the Labyrinth, even even not Lisa Gerard, but why am I Brendan Perry's first solo album, Eye of the Hunter, that came out in '99. That was like an amazing album too. And so all that kind of went into influencing the next Bell Barrow album. So it was that, also Boris,
Mhm.
the Japanese band. So they've always been a huge influence for me.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um,
who else?
hey,
Nick Cave. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I could go on and on, but Nick
Yeah,
Cave, and
yeah.
then obviously Danzig. Danzig is, I mean, I've always loved Danzig.
Sweet, man. This is awesome. We just have a minute left,
Oh, okay.
and I'm hoping we can maybe a part two at some point down the line here,
Yeah.
maybe a couple months or something if you're up for it.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to end on more of a positive note. You said before that you tend to be more cynical. In the remaining seconds that we have here, what is giving you hope right now?
I would say that, and this is not necessarily just because we happen to be having this interview, but I feel like there are artists and established sort of networks and news organizations that are doing these kind of interviews and sort of find because honestly, like this is how these kind of underground movement because right now, unfortunately, this is becoming underground, like having resisting the overarching, uh, dominant mindset, you got to start with an underground movement. I think